This is just the beginning.
Welcome to the Immigration Reset virtual event. I'm Steph Kite, a political reporter for Axios, and I'm coming to you from my home in Arlington, Virginia. Thank you to the USA Facts for making this third conversation possible. We've had a chance to discuss various topics, including the future of our economy, public health, and immigration policies. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Axios.com. Please follow along using the hashtag Axios events and @Axios on Twitter. Over the next 30 minutes, we will discuss bipartisan initiatives and their wide-ranging impacts on immigrants and refugees. Our first guest is the CEO of the League of United Latin American Citizens, Sindy Benavides. She's coming to us from Washington, D.C. Sindy, so good to have you here.
Steph, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So the coronavirus pandemic has impacted everyone and created new challenges in pretty much all areas of life. To start us off, can you just talk through some of the biggest challenges the pandemic has posed to immigrants and LULAC's work to advocate for immigrants?
Thank you for that question, Steph. And I will tell you that COVID-19 has impacted all Americans and the entire globe. But here in the United States, what we have seen is that particularly in communities of color, in the Latino community, in the African American community, in the Native American community, it's created devastation. In the Latino community specifically, we know that 5 out of 6 Latinos have to leave their houses every single day to work and get paid. Latinos are the essential workers in America. And so many of us are able to stay home because there are individuals who are working in the fields, who are working in our meat packing plants, who are working in our grocery stores, who are working in our hospitals, making sure that we are safe and healthy. And I will tell you, when we dive into these numbers, Steph, the fact is that when you look at farm workers, we're over 90% of farm workers, folks that pick our fruits and vegetables to make sure that we are able to eat a nutritious meal. We're over 35% of all meat packing workers, which, as we just passed Thanksgiving, so many of us were able to enjoy a turkey and a ham. And as we go into the holidays, again, we have food that is involved. And then lastly, I would say we are 1/4 of grocery store workers, and there's over 200,000 DACA individuals who are considered essential workers who are working on the front lines to keep America going. We also know that, unfortunately, Latinos, African Americans, and the Native American community, in terms of deaths, we over-index. We're 3 times that our Caucasian counterparts. And so certainly COVID-19 has had a severe devastation. When we look at the economy stuff, the fact is that in the Latino community, we have massive unemployment. We also know that many businesses, we estimate that over 50% of Latino businesses are permanently out of business, which means that this next stimulus package can't come soon enough.
You brought up this new term we have because of coronavirus, essential workers, many of whom, as you pointed out, are immigrants working in meatpacking plants, on farms, in healthcare facilities. I just kind of wanted to lean into that. What needs to happen to make sure all immigrant essential workers are treated fairly and protected from the virus?
As I think of the work that we've been doing, Steph, back in March, I remember we reached out to the CDC to ask for COVID-19 guidance in Spanish. And their response was, we don't have it and we don't know when we're going to have it. So we had to jump immediately to make sure that the information was in Spanish. And we created something called Ayuda en Español, or Help in Spanish. At that time, too, we were getting calls and emails from our workers, our meatpacking workers, who were literally marching into the slaughterhouses. And when they were getting there, they felt that they were putting their lives on the line. And what they were seeing is that their colleagues, the people that they work with every single day, were not showing up to work. They were missing. And part of what was happening, Steph, is that, so many of them were becoming ill with COVID-19. Some of them passed away. And so as we think about our essential workers, and that is an understatement, right? Because truly they are keeping our American economy going. They're keeping many of us safe, making sure that OSHA has stronger guidelines that OSHA actually has teeth and power in terms of accountability, and making sure that as we look at our essential workers, that we just don't say that, right? That we actually honor them, but making sure that they have protections in place, not only the PPE, which as at the very beginning of this pandemic, there was confusion in terms of federal government guidance, but also making sure that they are paid for the overtime that so many of them are paying because their colleagues are out, and making sure that when we look at the different industries, again, that there are guidance in place that are not just recommendations, but that are actual requirements, because we want to make sure that our food supply, that there's no disruption to our food supply, because then that really impacts all of us again.
Right. Along those lines, you mentioned workers at meatpacking plants. I know LULAC was involved with Tyson Foods' early efforts to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus in their plants. You all praised some of their efforts and precautions at the time. Now, of course, Tyson's is facing lawsuits, some of which have pretty serious allegations of mishandling the coronavirus in some of their plants. I kind of wanted to get your reaction to that and how seriously LULAC sees those issues.
You know, Steph, for us, when you have managers or people in positions of power at the Waterloo plant who are placing bets, that is an issue. And absolutely, Tyson should immediately fire and make sure that they terminate employees who are engaging in such conduct. I will tell you that LULAC has met with several companies, JBS, Tyson Foods, Smithfield, and so many others that we're still in the planning to meet with in 2021. And our role is centered around making sure that our workers are protected. We absolutely want to make sure that companies understand that we are paying attention. A large number of their workforce is not only Latino, but immigrants and refugees. And we want to make sure that as we talk about our essential workers, many of them in the meatpacking plant, that the companies are also taking steps, that they are taking intentional steps to make sure that the workers are protected. I will tell you, Steph, that some of these companies have heed to our recommendations in terms of PPE, in terms of overtime pay, in terms of also protecting our workers who may be over the age of 62 and in vulnerable positions. But clearly there's a lot of work to do. Clearly Tyson Foods has a lot of work to do. I know that they're doing independent investigation, but we want to see more. We want to make sure that Tyson Foods, along with any other, takes seriously actions by their employees when they're placing bets on the lives of our workers. Is just something that is not allowed, something that should absolutely be addressed immediately.
Great. So now looking forward to a new administration, I kind of want to hear a little bit about, in your conversations with state and local leaders, what are some of the immigration policies that they are most hoping or expecting President-elect Joe Biden to take action on quickly?
Well, I would tell you, Steph, that the first order of business is to undo Trump's reckless actions on immigration. And this includes actions like reinstating DACA and making sure to rescind the DHS memo that stripped that protections away from our immigrant eligible DACA recipients, making sure that we just redesignate and expand temporary protected status, also known as TPS. And what we've seen is that, unfortunately, many of those individuals are also the essential workers, and the expiration dates are coming up in early 2021. We also want to make sure that there's an expansion and that we include individuals that are from Venezuela, but also we've seen the natural disasters that have hit Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras recently, and make sure that we are also very thoughtful and expanding TPS. I will tell you too, it's making sure that we're reversing the public charge policy, which has kept so many immigrants from seeking basic needs. The truth is, Steph, that there is a corrosion of trust that has occurred within the immigrant community under this administration. So many immigrants, many who are in mixed status families with U.S. citizen children, U.S. citizen spouses who have served in our military, are not accessing services because they're so fearful of the repercussion from this government. You know, we also want to see our 11 million undocumented immigrants finally have a pathway to citizenship. And we think that that is actually going to happen under the new administration. The other one I will tell you, Steph, that is top of mind, especially as we're heading into the holidays, as we go into the new year, is that making sure that there are no raids, that there's a pause on raids that are occurring in the workplace. And again, what we're asking the administration and what we have asked through our letters, through our phone calls, is making sure that there is an assessment of the harmful policies done under the Trump administration when it comes to our refugees, making sure that we're looking at the Muslim ban and how this current administration, unfortunately, has impacted so many of our communities, so many of our refugees. The fact that there were 32 children that were left off an airplane when a federal judge ordered that specific policy be rescinded is just unfathomable. And not to mention, Steph, that we still have over 600 children who are separated from their parents.
Yeah. There is so much the Trump administration has done on immigration. There's a lot of things that the Biden administration has said they want to undo. I want to really quick ask you a question about the border. The border is one of the trickiest areas of immigration policy. We're already starting to see border crossings rise. How can the DHS Secretary choice of Mayorkas and Biden balance more compassionate policies while still enforcing the law in the U.S. at the border?
Thank you for that question, Steph. And I will tell you that LULAC is on the record in supporting the nomination of Alejandro Ali Mayorkas for DHS Secretary. And, part of what we think will happen as we go into the new administration is that because of the track record that Secretary Mayorkas has had as Deputy Secretary of DHS, that he already has a sound understanding of the Department of Homeland Security. We think absolutely that there should be more legal, I would say, staff and personnel that helps with the adjudication of the current pending cases. Certainly, one, to assess also the current policies in place by the Trump administration. Again, turning children away at the border, not allowing the US government to be able to assess if they qualify for humanitarian relief. And so I think immediately that would happen. And Steph, I would also say training, making sure that we are training our enforcement officers within the Department of Homeland Security. The truth is the last 4 years have been a nightmare for our immigrant community. The last 4 years, we've seen policies change overnight, like the zero tolerance policy, which caused great harm in our community. And so our expectation is that Ali Mayorkas will fully take on his role on day one, has already a sound understanding of the Department of Homeland Security as well as the Department of Justice, and will make sure to reverse some of those policies that have been so reckless and so harmful to our communities.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sindy, for joining us. This has been a great conversation. I'm now going to throw it to my colleague, Axios co-founder and CEO, Jim Vandehei, for our View from the Top segment.
Thank you very much, Steph. It is now my pleasure to have a conversation with Steve Ballmer, who's the founder of USA Facts. Steve, it's great to have a conversation on what is usually such a hyperbolic topic. And what I love about your organization is it's just the facts. So to be able to sort of break down, like when we talk about immigration, what are we really talking about? And I think to start, like just paint the picture of like, what is the immigrant population in America?
Yeah, it's interesting. About 14.5% right now of people in the U.S. is foreign born. Now, some of them may be naturalized citizens, some may not, but it's about 14.5%, which ironically approaches the highest levels ever of about 15% back in the early 1900s. In 1970, that number was down only 5%. Of our population is foreign born. If you look at it another way, about 1.6 million population growth in the United States in 2019. Over a third of that came from immigrants as opposed to births versus deaths of people living in the country. We are essentially back to our heyday in terms of being a land of immigrants.
And a big part of that is like people don't fully appreciate that we just have lower birth rates, and you do need like a robust population growth to be able to keep up as the size of your economy grows. When you think about immigration, like where are those people coming from? Like what were they doing? Where are they coming from? What are they coming to do?
Yeah, the biggest countries, if you will, for immigration are Mexico, China, Cuba. They'd be some of the very top. If you look at why people are coming, and I'm going to back out, Jim, tourist visas because I don't think it's really relevant. But once you put tourist visas aside, about 800,000 plus people come to work. Another 700,000 people are granted visas as to attach to family who's already in the United States. And then our student visas are down somewhat. About 700,000 people are granted visas. There are many more students who are already here on student visas, but we're down close to 50% in student visas over the course of the last 4 years.
Putting on your hat as someone who's run massive businesses and cuts across many industries, what would be the effect if we didn't have immigration? Like how much of a talent suck would that be? How much of a talent wall would that be?
Yeah, if you look at the 800,000 or so visas that are granted, 280,000 of those, biggest segment would be in agriculture. Big deal. But 180,000 of them are in so-called H-1B visas, which go to high-skill immigration. When I was running Microsoft, we depended fundamentally not just on native-born engineers, but on foreign-born engineers. If you look across Silicon Valley, I don't know all the stats, but I'll bet you'll find 50% of the engineers just about were foreign-born. So it is a big deal for companies like Microsoft. Amazon is the leading company in terms of applications for H-1B visas. It really is a big deal for keeping our tech economy vibrant. Unless people want to see more of those tech and engineering jobs in other countries, I think it's pretty important.
President Trump obviously made a big deal throughout most of his presidency about sort of the infiltration of our borders, especially the southern border. What's the reality on enforcement? Is enforcement waning? Is enforcement intensifying? What are the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, it's interesting. Enforcement, at least, is measured by the number of people who are apprehended at the border. Now, one thing people miss is you can be apprehended at the border for two reasons. The numbers can flux for two reasons. We are enforcing more, and or more people are actually coming or trying to come illegally into the country. The number is up from about 400,000 a few years ago to about 800,000 border apprehensions on our southern border with Mexico, if you will. But that number is not as big as the, say, 1 million apprehensions that we had about 20 years ago in the year 2000.
And where do you see, when you think of next year, you think of a new administration coming in, what do you see happening with immigration? What do you think? Do you think it'll be front and center? Do you anticipate that the Biden administration will tackle immigration reform? Or do you think it ends up taking a back seat to the coronavirus and sort of broader economic recovery?
Well, certainly, Jim, I'm not as much a political prognosticator, but if you take a look at it, I think things like Corona and the economy will take forefront. But when you talk about the economy, as we were talking about earlier, you can't not talk about immigration, whether it's high skilled or people who are already living here. When you talk about healthcare and vaccination, right now, for example, if you're an undocumented immigrant, about 12 million people in our country are undocumented, which is 3 to 4%. You're not eligible for Medicaid, for example. So really how we treat our immigrant population and how we bring people in will be key to both economic and physical health.
And I'm curious, as someone who ran Microsoft, owns a basketball team, runs a massive foundation, does a lot of work across other industries. Like, if you were king for a day, like what is like the one or two things that can be done that really could have kind of a magical effect on U.S. productivity, U.S. innovation, on the immigration front?
Yeah, on the immigration front, I believe, and this is my own belief, my belief is somehow we have to come to grips with our large undocumented population. The political sorts need to sort that out, but I think not sorting out and deciding what happens to those 12 million people who live here on an undocumented basis is critical. I also think that the push to restrict student visas and other high skill visas, you got to put a question mark on that because it's so fundamental to our growth. Education is an export business for us, actually. And at the end of the day, at least it's my belief that we want all the high skilled jobs in the world in our country because it has been a real blessing for us. I'm the son of an immigrant myself, and everybody has to form their own point of view, but I know there's an economic vitality that is unmatched that comes from high-skilled immigration.
Steve, thank you for a fascinating conversation. Thank you to USA Facts for making this broader discussion about immigration possible, and have a safe and healthy holiday.
Thanks, Jim. Happy holidays to you.
Thank you. Back to you, Steph.
Thanks, Jim. My next guest is the co-founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group and former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, joining us from Washington, D.C. Secretary, thanks for joining us.
Good to be on.
It has been a busy year during the pandemic for immigration policies and changes, and it's been a busy 4 years under President Trump. What do you think will be some of the longest lasting impacts on the U.S. immigration system?
I think the inhumanity with respect to the separated children will probably leave a lasting scar, not only on the individuals involved, but on everybody who observes or participates in the immigration process. I think it's also created a kind of a sense of maybe ill will and lack of trust between a lot of the general public and CBP and ICE, and that's going to take some repair work with the incoming administration. So, I mean, I think these are they're remediable issues, but they will have a reasonably long tail.
Yeah. You were Homeland Security Secretary under President Bush after 9/11. Do you feel that any of the policies the Bush administration pursued led to some of the harsh immigration policies that we've seen under President Trump?
No, I mean, they may have been an excuse that was used to justify what was clearly hostility to immigrants and, in fact, to people who were outside the United States. But it would be a mischaracterization of what the Bush administration did to treat it as a precedent. Look, the number one responsibility we had in the Bush administration was vetting people for security. And that was also done by the Obama administration. And that was focused on specific individuals where there was some basis to be concerned about the fact they might be connected with terrorists, or their travel or their behavior somehow suggested there was a potential risk. What the Trump administration started out doing was characterizing all Muslims as a threat. The Bush administration quite deliberately rejected that view. In fact, President Bush early on, like within the first week after 9/11, said, this is not a war on Islam. So essentially, the Trump administration used counterterrorism as an excuse or justification for what eventually Stephen Miller admitted, which is he just doesn't like immigrants, wants to reduce immigration, legal and illegal, and he'll use any device possible to achieve that end.
And did some of those actions, like the so-called Muslim ban, did that end up actually hurting the effort to combat international terrorism?
Well, I think broad-based bans like that did hurt the effort to combat terrorism. First of all, it fed into the narrative of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda that could say, you see, we've been telling you all along that the West hates you, they hate your religion, therefore you should join up with us. It also created, as I said a little earlier, a sense of mistrust among significant parts of the population and the agency. And that was not only bad for the mission of immigration control, but it was more generally bad for the mission that DHS has across the entire spectrum of security problems. And so that's going to take repair work. But the good news is, I think it'll be relatively soon for the new administration to begin to reverse some of these errors.
That's a hopeful thought. The other day, I was on a call with the acting CBP Commissioner, Mark Morgan, who sought to blame some of the increased activity we've seen at the southwest border on, at least in part, on some of Joe Biden's stated policies on immigration. Is that a real thing? Can stated policies and plans on immigration actually have real impacts on immigration flows at the border?
Well, policies you announce could have an effect. I mean, if you were to say we're going to have open borders, everybody come on in, that would definitely drive migration. But nothing the president-elect has said remotely suggests open borders or would encourage people to come in, in a larger number. Now, it may be that the gangs and the traffickers will mischaracterize what the new administration will do because they want to promote migration because they make money off of it. But this is not the fault of the administration that's coming in. This would be simply a manipulation by organized criminal groups for their own nefarious purposes.
Yeah. So along those lines, how should the Biden administration, Ali Mayorkas, if he's confirmed as DHS secretary, and Joe Biden, how do they balance promises for more compassionate immigration policies with the need to enforce the law at the border?
Well, you can be compassionate, but you can be firm, and you can be firm in a way that respects human dignity, but nevertheless enforces the law. And again, good news here is that incoming Secretary-designate Mayorkas was the deputy. He was the head of CIS. So he has a great deal of personal familiarity with these issues and lived through them when, the Obama administration was running the department. And I think what you need to do is this. You need to, first of all, understand what is driving people to migrate illegally. Sometimes it's natural disasters. Sometimes it is violence in the sending country. And certainly part of the strategy is trying to address the issues that are impelling this kind of migration. Second, to the extent you have people with legitimate refugee claims, or at least who claim to have a right to asylum, you need to adjudicate those cases fairly but relatively expeditiously. And that may mean bringing more people on board to do it in a fair way, but in a speedy way. When you have to hold people pending a proceeding, you should find a humane way to do it. Some people will need to be detained, but should be done so in a facility that can manage it properly. Some may be allowed out with a bracelet or some kind of supervision. But again, it's about focusing on using these tools to achieve the result of having people come to their hearings, not as a device to be deliberately cruel as a way of somehow deterring migration by suggesting that you're inhumane in the United States.
Right. So given the complicated situation we're in and the changes in the kinds of migrants that we're seeing come to the border, how important do you think it will be for Ali Mayorkas and Joe Biden to really have relationships with Mexico and some of the Central American countries to work on solutions?
Well, I think it's very important for the incoming administration to reach out to and have good relations with our neighbors in the South, as we did under President Bush, because first of all, they're part of the process of regulating the flow of illegal migration. Second, we do need to get cooperation on law enforcement. Many of these migrants are being trafficked in by criminal organizations, and that means we have to have enforcement on both sides of the border and also in Central America. And then, as I said, maybe the most important medium to long-term objective is to reduce the pressure that is bringing people to run and put their lives at risk to flee up north. Now, I happen to believe there is a place for legal migration and for people to be coming in temporarily with a visa to do work that Americans need to have done and that will not be done by American citizens. But again, that has to be a regulated process. So to me, a balanced approach, which I'm sure the incoming administration knows, is on the one hand, a structured, regulated legal path for temporary migration, an expeditious resolution of claims of asylum to find which ones are legitimate, and then enforcing the law against those who don't want to take legal avenues. And that means not just against the migrants, but against the employers who may be bringing them in.
Right, right. Secretary, you wrote earlier this year about your concerns that DHS was being politicized and used as sort of a political tool by President Trump. How do you undo that at an agency like DHS? And are you at all concerned that the agency could continue to be politicized in other directions as well?
I'm very confident the agency will not be politicized. And I think early on, you will hear a message from the incoming secretary saying, look, we're here to enforce the laws, and we're here to focus on the main part of our job, whether it's security at the airport or at the border or wherever. We are not here to be a private police force or posse for a president who wants to show how tough he is against, quote, liberal Democratic mayors, as was exactly the rationale that was offered by Donald Trump when he had people deploying people who were trained for border activity in cities in the interior of the U.S. This is very easy to correct. A clear statement and then simply not engaging in this kind of misbehavior will send a very, very important message. And a message, by the way, that has to be heard not just by the public at large, but by the people in the agency itself.
Right. DHS has been at the center of quite a few scandals. One of them you mentioned just now, also family separation. You and several other former heads of DHS recently wrote a letter about the need for better congressional oversight. And I just kind of wanted to ask you why that's so important and how you think there can be better oversight when it comes to DHS.
If you consolidated oversight in a Homeland Security Committee in the Senate and the House, as opposed to now having different pieces of the department supervised by different committees, all of which have their own agenda, you could then, first of all, regularly get an authorization bill, which lays out the guidelines and the lanes in the road for what the agency should do and shouldn't do. You'd have a kind of a unity of perspective between the agency leadership and the congressional leadership. And you wouldn't have competing committee chairmen pursuing their own agendas with respect to some part of the department, which then pulls the department in different directions. Every secretary I know during their tenure felt that they would have benefited from having the kind of singular oversight that every other department has, like the Defense Department.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So these days, when we hear about immigration changes to the system, it's almost always coming from the executive branch. You were DHS secretary when Congress last passed comprehensive immigration reform. The need is obviously there. And I guess the $1 million question is, do you think there is actually a way forward for serious immigration legislation under President Biden?
You know, in the past, we've gotten bipartisan agreement. I think maybe now people will realize it's a dysfunctional system. We need to fix it and rationalize it in a strategic way. And then we will save money and also make it work better.
Right. Well, Secretary, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your thoughts and expertise.
Good to be on.
Thank you all for joining this afternoon for another virtual event that made everyone smarter, faster. Thank you to our sponsor, USA Facts, for making this event possible. For the latest news, please follow our dashboard at Axios.com or on the Axios app. You can sign up for all of the Axios newsletters at signup.axios.com. Before you go, we did want to share some news about what's next for Axios in the coming months. We will be expanding into local markets to get you smarter, faster about where you live. For more information about our local news endeavor, you can check out axios.com/local. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you on axios.com.